Buju, wago shindagu migizi indodem, gazaga squaji mekag, indunjaba. Today I'd like to offer a perspective about climate change's threat to indigenous cultures and how our ancient taboos, living cultures and customs are operating in a brand new world. I'll do this from an Ojibwe perspective since this is the culture that I live and know the best. But I think it does have implications for many other indigenous peoples in many other parts of the world. In the Ojibwe world, for example, we have a custom that there's a certain type of legends, winter legends. These are stories about Buju, who's a legendary figure, half human, half spirit, who does all kinds of things, names the world, plays tricks on animals. Some of the stories are humorous and entertaining, others are much more sacred and spiritual. And during this time of the year, when we still have lots of snow on the ground, then that's when we tell these stories. There are a variety of reasons for it, and the why matters as well when we think about what do we do in the face of climate change when there isn't nearly as much snowfall or not as much in or the range of wintertime is shrinking. So first of all, there are a couple of different ways that different Ojibwe people will describe the taboos around when it's okay to tell winter legends and so forth. And I should preface these remarks by saying I do not speak for all Ojibwe people. I am one human being. I got a house full of natives here. I don't even know what they're thinking half the time, and I'm only offering my own personal perspective on this. I do speak Ojibwe and I do operate in a lot of cultural space, but when you look at Ojibwe country, there are 600,000 of us spread across 141 Ojibwe First Nations in Canada and across reservations in the United States, in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, North Dakota, and Montana. And as a result, it's not even accurate to say there is the Ojibwe culture. There is a collection of interrelated cultural groups and interrelated dialect groupings, and nobody speaks for all of them. Even within an immediate region, there might be quite a bit of variation between what different elders are saying. So I think that's an important disclaimer before we proceed. But my understanding of winter legends and the rules around them are these. First of all, there is a politeness protocol. During the winter months, bears are hibernating, birds have migrated south for the winter, many animals are dormant or at least less active. And since a lot of our stories revolve around things in the natural world, it is considered a little bit more polite to tell their stories when they're not right in front of us. And so there's kind of a kindness or a politeness protocol. And certainly there's a lot of politeness across Ojibwe culture in many other ways. And so this resonates with that. But I think it's much more than that too. So I remember Leonard Moose and other elders of mine who would share that the frog, the spring peeper, the frog, has a very powerful spiritual function. For starters, a frog has 5 fingers on his hand, just like we do, and that those 5 fingers count the 5 months of winter. So, Gashkadino Gizis, November, Manitou Gizis Uns, December, Gichimanidu Gizis, January, Namebini Gizis, February, and Onabini Gizis, March. Those 5 months are the 5 months of winter. Those are the 5 months when the frog is asleep. And when the frog wakes up in the spring, the spring peepers have a very loud, powerful voice. And that in fact, the frogs have a spiritual gift beyond even an intuition that they are able to call with their voices out to the spirits to ask for whatever the world is in need of. So if there is a drought and we are in need of rain, or if certain species have been crashing, they will communicate these things so that we can receive, as a planet, the help that we need. And when the frogs start to sing, then we as humans will give them the bandwidth to be heard. So our sacred legends, our winter legends, are sacred. We're talking about Wayne Buju, we're talking about many special spiritual things. So we are taking more bandwidth because these stories are a way of communicating with the Manitug in the winter. But in the spring, when the frogs start singing, we reduce our use of that communication band so the frogs can take over and communicate our needs to the spirits. So there's this kind of yin-yang thing. There's a time when we operate on that bandwidth, and there's a time when the frogs operate on that bandwidth, and so we take turns. We are operating with awareness of what is happening in the natural world and with respect for those things. In our family, we operate a maple sugar harvest, and when we start our harvest in the wintertime, we knock it off as soon as the frogs start singing. In fact, a whole variety of things happen immediately at the same time that will indicate it's time to stop the spring maple harvest. So the sounding of the frogs is obvious, loud, unmistakable. But at the same time, you'll see an abundance of moths that will show up in the sap buckets. The sap itself will start to turn kind of white and cloudy, and all of those things indicate this harvest has to be done. If you persisted after that time, as a practical measure, your sap would start to ferment and other things would go wrong. But we listen to the frogs, pull our taps immediately, and all of those kind of natural environment things are all happening at the same time because there's a spiritual as well as an ecological transition that is happening. So in addition to our politeness about the bears and the migrating birds and things like that, there's this kind of spiritual thing with regard to frogs. By the way, in Ojibwe culture too, not only do we stop with the maple harvest, but we stop telling legends at the same time for the same reason. And there's a saying that if somebody persists and tells legends out of season, that we could be marked by a frog or a giant toad. And some people will even say that the bumpy spots on the back of the toad are like, where they carry medicine. And that if you get marked by the frog or the toad, it will show up in the form of blue welts. And so people might say something like a lot of native babies have blue birthmarks on their back, butt, or legs. All of my kids ended up having those birthmarks. And, sometimes I think it's considered like a little inappropriate now. Some people would call them Mongolian birthmarks or things like that. But the blue birthmarks, some people will say, are a remnant of when someone in the family tree told legends out of season, and that the blue mark got passed down through the family. So I must have had someone in my family tree who told legends out of season back in the day. That's a little bit about, some of the taboos and kind of what they are and why they are. But it's a little bit more than that. So nowadays, we are presented with uncommon and challenging times, climate change. And as a result, we are seeing things, like for example, with our wild rice harvest, where the natural range of wild rice used to extend way down into Missouri even. And the range has continued to drift further north as a factor of climate change. But the wild rice cannot proliferate as you get too far north because you also need more shallow, muddy-bottomed lakes and rivers where the rice can proliferate. And so we are concerned about the future vitality of wild rice as a factor of climate change. The Ojibwe people, among other things, there were practical reasons for the migration from the East Coast heading west, but among them there were prophets also who appeared and said, move west to the land where food grows on water as climate changes. And we're looking at the real possibility that there will not be nearly as much wild rice, or that some parts of Ojibwe country will no longer have wild rice, or that it could maybe someday even disappear from the planet. These things are quite terrifying because it's not just about the food, but it's about these spiritual teachings around the food, and it's also about identity. How can you be the wild rice people if there's no wild rice? Now, you'll still be something, and I'm not saying that what you are will be completely colonized, white person with a little bit of brown skin, but it'll be different. And similarly now, we've seen other things shifting and changing. So this year, even though we're in the middle of a snowstorm here right now in Bemidji, we're getting, 5 to 15 inches of snow. But ultimately, this has been one of our drier and warmer winters, certainly within my memory, and all the data supports that. And we have seen it take longer for the ice to be safe for people to go out ice fishing. We have seen, and people learning their lessons the hard way. And we have seen, the birds coming back earlier, the fish spawns starting earlier. The climate is most definitely changing. And although some years may be a little colder and warmer, it's kind of like a stock market, it goes up and down, but the general trend, is up. We might be in a warm spike right now, but the general pattern will be for that to continue, even though it could be colder next year. And so what happens, we have 5 months where we're used to telling legends and doing the stories, ceremonies, gatherings, and so forth that are associated with them. What if that range shrinks? What if it goes down to 3 months? What if we get a summer, like they're saying we'll have a climate like Oklahoma? What if there's no snow ever? Does that mean we don't get to tell legends ever? And in many parts of Ojibwe country, they're already in these circumstances where, I know some friends in the Eastern Great Lakes had this happen just this year. The frogs started to sing. So they're like, we better pull taps. And then they got 18 inches of snow, and so they're challenges. And I think we will see more of them. It doesn't take much, just a slight shift in the weather pattern, and the southern parts or eastern parts of Ojibwe country might be warm enough where the patterns for frogs and so forth change too. And so how do we make these determinations going forward? And I would just offer these thoughts. First of all cultures change, right? Whoever's living in England right now, they're still very English, but they live their lives very differently than the people who built Stonehenge, and probably worship God differently and so forth too. That doesn't mean they're not authentically English, but they're certainly different from the Druids. And some kinds of change, even some kinds of cultural change, might be positive, like giving up on human sacrifices. I'm down with that. But some kinds can be negative too, and we want to be recognizable to our ancestors. I've never met an elder from any culture who did not shake his or her head and go, oh, kids these days. And so there's always a tension about cultural change and cultural continuity. I think on the one hand, we want to and should give ourselves permission to do some evolving and adaptation, whether it's to our times or to a changing climate. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we should just do things any which way. This kind of decision making is further complicated by the fact that when any culture is under threat, and it is obvious that many indigenous cultures are under threat. We've been dealing with colonization for hundreds of years, and it's had its effects. So many indigenous languages have very few speakers, or mainly elder speakers, and so forth, just as one manifestation of cultural shift and change. And these threats to cultures have predictable, like anthropological dimensions. What I mean by that is this. If a culture revolved around ceremonies where people had very long legends delivered in an indigenous language and a long, deep song repertoire, hundreds and hundreds of songs associated with a particular ceremony. I think in former times, the substance of the legends and the song repertoire and the fact that it's being done in Ojibwe or whatever the tribal language is would matter much more than some of the more performative dimensions of culture. Performative dimensions of culture could be this. You got to wear a red shirt for this particular ceremony. You have to wear a ribbon skirt for this ceremony. Whatever those sort of things, you have to face this direction. Or there must be whatever, some natural phenomenon or, whatever, in order to make it possible to do your ceremony. And so we want things to be right, we want things to be strict, and we want things to be ancient. And so we often start to emphasize when we're losing a language or a song repertoire or nobody's able to deliver the 6-hour-long legend, we start to emphasize some of these things. Make sure you're facing east, make sure you're wearing the red shirt, make sure that, whatever. And those things, I'm not saying that they do not matter. They matter. What I'm saying is that they get emphasized over those more substantive pieces of culture. And as a result, there's a little bit of a tendency among Native people who are concerned about cultural threat or loss to become dogmatic or become culture police and give their fellow natives a really hard time. So somebody's dealing with a low snow winter and there's barely a dusting on the ground and someone else is chewing them out for telling legends out of season, and now something really bad's going to happen. Not saying who's right and who's wrong, but one of the net effects of becoming culture police and being super dogmatic is that we end up scaring people away from participating in or practicing their culture. And if we want the culture to live, this is where it may be helpful to find and foster a certain amount of flexibility. Now, I'm somebody who actually does tell 6-hour-long legends and, run ceremonies with big song repertoires and things like that. I'm not saying those things should be left by the wayside. What I'm saying is that, first of all, we should just center our core values as a people. Things like kindness, generosity, respect, and so forth. I've been a little dismayed by some of the arguments where somebody takes a picture of the Northern Lights and someone else is shouting them down and telling them they're not native. I think ultimately we should not be in the business of trying to out-Indian one another or shame one another. That doesn't mean that we don't have rules or that they shouldn't be honored. But I think as a matter of disposition, I'm a little more of the view that I know what I do. When I hear those frogs, all right, I'm pulling my taps and I'm done telling legends. And this winter we had very little snow until today, for a while here, but the ground was still frozen, hadn't heard the frogs. In my view, if someone was telling legends, I wouldn't have given them a hard time. That's me, and wouldn't seek to impose that on anyone else. If someone else is doing something different somewhere else, that's their way. I know what mine is. But ultimately, with climate change, we are going to see new and bigger challenges to some of these ancient taboos and cultural protocols. And I think ultimately, we will need to find the best ways to develop an evolving set of cultural rules and expectations that can accommodate a new climate and still foster and support our ancient beliefs and practices. I do think there is a way forward, and it won't be exactly what people were doing in 1491. And it is acceptable not to do something exactly as it was done in 1491 if the alternative would be not to do it at all. Thanks for watching today. Miigwech. Thanks for watching today. I'm Anton Treuer. Let's keep in touch. I'm active on social media And my website has lots of information on my books, speaking engagements, resources for the Ojibwe language, teachers, and more. Miigwech.